My name is Jules Simner, and I'm a professor of neuropsychology at the University of Sussex in the UK and previously at University of Edinburgh. And I've spent the last 20 years studying synesthesia in the human mind and brain. So I have a talk to present to you today, which is on synesthesia in children. So before we start, let's just go over what it is we mean by synesthesia. So synesthesia is a rare, lifelong neurological trait. Some people call it a condition, but I would call it a neurological trait that causes a consistent merging of sensations. So what I mean by that is that the sensation of hearing might cause someone with synesthesia to have a sensation of colours. So here is an artist representation of someone with sound colour synesthesia. And for her, the sound of the violin causes her to see colours in the visual field, coloured photisms, we call them, colour experiences. So sound sensation triggers colour sensations. But there are many, many different kinds of synesthesia, maybe over 100 of them. So here are a few more. A very common form of synesthesia is called grapheme colour synesthesia. Now, a grapheme is just a letter or a number. So someone with grapheme colour synesthesia has the experience of colours when they think about letters and numbers. So sometimes those colours might be seen projected onto the typeface, but equally synesthesia can be sort of an overwhelming feeling. So you might not see colours, but you might absolutely know the colour of every letter of the alphabet, and those colours remain unchanged for your whole life. So if you're a synesthete, you might feel very strongly that the letter E is, say, green, the letter A is red, for example. Another kind of synesthesia is called lexical gustatory synesthesia. And for people with this form, words trigger sensations of taste in the mouth. So hearing words or reading words or even thinking about words floods the mouth with sensations of taste. And this chap here is James Wannerton. He's the president of the UK Synesthesia Association. And for James, my name, Julia, floods his mouth with orange fruit sweets. Here's another form of synesthesia, this time a bit more common, and this is time-space synesthesia. So people with this variant have a very strong sense that time is mapped out in space. For example, the months of the year might form a kind of running track around the body. And so people with time-space synesthesia could point to say, this is November, and over here, this is May. And that's not something that most people can do. And finally, here's another example. This is perhaps one of my favorite forms of synesthesia, and we might call this personification synesthesia, or in the past, I've named this ordinal linguistic personification. And what this is that instead of letters and numbers triggering colors, they trigger the very strong sensation of a gender or personality type. So this is an example I took from the internet, and this is a very talented synesthete who can very easily draw her personifications or his personifications. And for this person, number 4 is a short-tempered woman, number 9 is an old man who's friends with 8, and number 10 is a motherly female. So many different forms of synesthesia. Now, if you don't have synesthesia, this is going to seem very unusual, obviously. So let's just talk about the neurological evidence, because what we know is that people with these synesthesias have very tiny, very subtle differences in the brain that are related to having synesthesia. So here's a brain scan from a study by our Dutch colleagues, and they have been able to show that people with coloured letters and numbers have extra pockets of white matter in the brain, just right, benign extra pockets of white matter, kind of near to colour selective regions. Here's a brain scan from a study, one of our own studies, and this shows that when synesthetes have synesthetic tastes, that they also have unusual activation in their taste area of the brain, in the gustatory cortex or near to the gustatory cortex. Here's a brain scan by our colleagues who looked at time-space synesthesia, and they found very subtle differences in the brains of synesthetes, this time in an area of the brain that's responsible for sequencing things like January, February, March, or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and very tiny differences in the brain just there. And here's a final brain scan from one of my own studies again. And here we tested a group of personifying synesthetes, and we found that they have very subtle differences in the white matter in the corpus callosum. This is an area of the brain that we know is implicated in social processing. So Many types of synesthesia, much evidence for synesthesia being a genuine neurological trait. A rare trait. I said it's a rare trait, so let's just briefly touch on that. So we know that synesthesia is found in only around 1 in 23 people, or at least 1 in 23 people, and that's only 4.4% of the population. And we know this from some of my own studies where I've individually screened thousands and thousands of people with objective tests for synesthesia. And every now and then we'll find a synesthete. And then when we count them up, we find that there are at least 4.4% of the population have synesthesia. Now, this seems very, very rare, and it is very rare. But actually, if you scale up 4.4% to the entire planet, we know that there are over 340 million synesthetes worldwide, which is roughly the entire population of the United States, equivalent to the entire population of the United States. Or equally, it's equivalent to the entire combined populations of Algeria, Nigeria, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana. So we're talking about very large numbers of people, 340 million people with synesthesia. So it's rare, but it's not insignificant. So this talk is about synesthesia in children. And we might first of all ask, why study synesthesia in children? And there are a number of reasons. The first reason is that synesthesia exists in childhood. We know it exists in childhood. There have been a number of studies now showing synesthetic children and the way that synesthesia manifests in children. So we know that synesthesia develops through childhood. We know that synesthesia crystallizes through childhood. We know that changes happen in childhood, and it's an important time for synesthetes. So, for example, in a study we ran in 2006, we looked at a group of children with coloured letters and numbers, and we found that at the age of around 6, only about a third of their alphabet and numbers were coloured. Only around a third of them had fixed, consistent colours. Whereas, not very much later, just a year or two later, we found that 2/3 of their colours, their letters and numbers were coloured. So what we can see is that synesthesia is developing through childhood. Childhood is an important time for synesthetes. And this is just the data from that study. We also know that synesthesia is moulded by childhood. Synesthesia is somehow crystallized in childhood to a large extent. And we know this in a couple of ways. So first of all, back in 2003, in a study with my colleague, Jamie Ward, we looked at word taste synesthesia. So this is when hearing words or thinking about words floods the mouth with sensations of taste. Now, what we found, first of all, that's important here is we found that synesthetic tastes are tied to experience. They're tied to the kind of life you've had. So if you're somebody who loves roast dinners and eats roast dinners all the time, then the taste of a roast dinner will feature prominently in your synesthesia. So put simply, real life diet impacts on the flavors that rush into your mouth when you have synesthesia. So that's the first thing, but really, and we can see that here, we can see that tastes that are frequent in synesthesia are also frequently eaten in diet. But what's really important is we found that synesthesia is much more influenced by the childhood diet than the adult diet. So if we give dietary questionnaires to adult synesthetes and to their parents, and we find out what they eat as adults versus what they ate as children, we find that their childhood diet is significantly more likely to reflect their synesthesia. So, synesthesia is full of childhood foods, if you like. And this tells us that the synesthesia was somehow crystallized in childhood. We also know that it's molded by childhood in other ways. So this is a study that we've really only just finished in the last week. So this is a study with my student, Emily Roos. And we have found that you get far stronger synesthesia triggered by languages you learned as a child versus as an adult. So what we did in this study was we tested a very special synesthete. He not only has tastes triggered by words, he's also a hyperpolyglot. Now, a hyperpolyglot is someone who speaks more than 7 languages fluently. And This synesthete happens to be a hyperpolyglot, and he speaks around 13 different languages. And so what we did was we looked at how strong the synesthesia was in each of these languages that he speaks, because his synesthesia is triggered by words. So we looked at how strong the synesthesia is for him when it's triggered by English words versus, say, Italian words. Now, the important thing is that, of course, this person did not learn all the languages once overnight. They learned them slowly throughout their life. So we know that English and Urdu were languages that he learned, pretty much from birth. Then he learned French and Punjabi and Spanish. He went to live in Argentina and so on. And then he learned Portuguese and Russian and Japanese and Hindi and Mandarin, Persian, Arabic, and Italian. He learned them through childhood into adulthood. So what we were able to ask is his synesthesia strongest from the languages he learned as a child or when he was younger? And the answer to that is yes. So what you can see on this graph is how strong his synesthesia is. We gave him 20 words in each language, and we found out how many of those words triggered synesthetic tastes. And what we found is that he had more synesthesia in the languages that he was really proficient at. We measured how proficient he was. We took a rating of how proficient he was. And so languages he speaks very, very, very well have most synesthesia. And of course, these are the languages that he learned when he was youngest. Okay? So what we're also seeing here is that languages learned in childhood are the most strongest triggers of synesthesia. So again, synesthesia is being molded somehow, crystallized somehow, is strongest somehow, developing through childhood. So I just want to jump back a couple of slides, because I've talked about the fact that synesthesia is developing through childhood. And obviously, with this example here, the synesthesia can't develop until the child learns letters and numbers. You can't have colored letters and numbers if you don't know what a letter is. But this doesn't mean that the synesthetic baby had no synesthesia at all. In fact, there's a good reason to think that synesthesia is inherited genetically. So there are studies from our colleagues looking at genes tied to synesthesia or chromosomes tied to synesthesia. But the other thing we might also think about is how synesthete baby brains are different from everybody's brains as babies, because there's a very elegant theory called the neonatal synesthesia hypothesis. And this was proposed by my colleague Daphne Maurer. And the neonatal synesthesia hypothesis suggests that synesthetes had synesthetic brains as babies, but that all of us, everybody, is born with a slightly synesthetic brain. The difference is that for most people, all the synesthesia drops out over time as you grow up. But for synesthetes, that synesthetic baby brain lasts, it stays into adulthood, and it maybe even gets stronger. So the idea is that we were all born with synesthetic brains. For most people, the synesthesia falls away, but for synesthetes, it sticks around and maybe even gets stronger. Now, it's quite a controversial theory. Some people don't adhere to this theory. I personally find it very elegant, because it accounts for a lot of data we've gathered, which would be really difficult to explain in any other way. So what it really nicely accounts for is that it turns out that not just synesthetes have a kind of merging of the senses. They have a kind of explicit merging of the senses that they feel every day of their lives. But it turns out that everybody, all people, even non-synesthetes, have their senses speaking to each other in a kind of crosstalk, just like a synesthete, but very subtle. So I'm not a synesthete, but it turns out that I do have slightly synesthetic associations, really subtle intuitions about how the senses map together. And my subtle intuitions happen to be the same as synesthetes' sort of explicit feelings and explicit experiences. So I'll give you some examples. Okay? So what we know is that all people, not just synesthetes, have an intuition about the color of sounds. So if I play you a piano and I tinkle on the very high notes and I crash down on the very low notes, and I say, which one of those sounds is a pale light yellow and which one is deep dark purple, all of us have this intuition, or many of us share this intuition, that the high notes are somehow lighter in color than the low notes. Now, this was confirmed in a study by my colleague Jamie Ward and his team. But what they also found really importantly is that this intuition that all people share is the same as how things operate for a synesthete. So synesthetes can see colors from sounds, They can see them and are consciously aware of them. And for synesthetes, they have exactly the same rule operating, that when they hear a high-pitched sound, the color they experience is likely to be a light color. And when they hear a low-pitched sound, the color is likely to be a dark color. So what we're seeing here is that everybody in the world sharing this intuition, synesthetes experiencing it explicitly, everybody else having it as a subtle intuition, almost as if it's the remnant of something we all shared, a remnant of a synesthetic brain we all had as a baby. With most people having intuitions that just sort of are very subtle and fade away, whereas synesthetes having them maintained and maybe even growing stronger. So we've also found other cross-sensory associations in all people. We found in a study I ran with my student, Rebecca Slocum, we found that all people share a preference for the way taste and touch interact. And here we gave 100 people a candy. Half of them had the candy with a rough surface, and the other half had the candy with a smooth surface, but it was an identical candy. It was made from the same batch. It was a sort of lemony, sugary flavor, all from the same batch. Half the people had it with a rough surface, half the people with a smooth surface. We simply asked them to tell us how sweet or sour the candy was, how sweet or sour the candy was. And we found that people who had had the candy with a rough surface felt that it tasted more sour than the people who had had it with a smooth surface. So there's some kind of intuition, some low-level intuition for all of us that sour is rough and smooth is sweet. And again, we can see this explicitly in synesthetes who have more conscious access to these associations. And finally, a study I ran with my student Vera Ludwig, we were trying to find out if there was an association between touch and color. We gave people 6 shapes to feel, one after another in a random order. They couldn't see the shapes, they were hidden out of sight, they could just feel them. And we asked them to choose a color for each shape from an electronic color palette. Pick any color you like. People doing this study thought that it was a bonkers, they thought it was a really strange thing to ask. They felt they were replying randomly, but actually we found a very strong finding, which was that people tend to think that pointed objects are lighter in color than rounded objects. Now, you know, it may be that this is learned from the environment, but it may be that it's somehow innate, who knows? But what we do know is that all people have an intuition for how color and touch relate, and taste and touch, and sound and color, and so on. And what's really important is that these intuitions are also shared with synesthetes. Synesthetes have them explicitly, suggesting we may have all originally had a similar brain as babies, or at least that there are things in common between synesthetes and non-synesthetes. And just to end with one more here, my colleague Peter Walker at Lancaster University once asked me whether the taste of lemons were fast or slow. And for me, they very much feel fast. The taste of a lemon feels like a fast taste. I have no idea why, it's just an intuition I have, and it's also shared by most people. So lots of these cross-sensory intuitions. One thing that we've been able to also do is show that they exist also in non-human animals. So we have a study where we asked dog owners to bring their dogs into the lab, and we found that dogs also share cross-sensory associations. So what we did in this study was we had the dog seated in front of the dog owner, and we projected a light on the wall, and the light was either elevated from the ground or it was down low by the ground. And at the same time, we played a sound. And we found that dogs were much more likely to attend to the elevated shape on the wall when the sound they heard was high pitch. So high pitched sounds were making them concentrate on high areas of space. And when we played them low pitched sounds, they were much more likely to attend to the shape that was down to the ground. So dogs have this kind of intuition that high pitch is the same as high in space. And we also showed that they have other kinds of cross-sensory associations. So we in a second study, we trained the dogs to touch an object that was making a sound. And we had 2 objects, and one of the objects would be making a sound, and we trained the dog to walk over to the object that was making the sound. And what we found was that they are much more likely to walk over to the large object if it's playing a deep sound. And they're more likely, or faster rather, to walk over to the small object when it is playing a high-pitched sound. And this was this series of studies was conducted with my PhD student, Anna Koshnowska, and our colleague, David Reeby. And we really have shown in fairly convincing ways that dogs are expressing or showing that they have these cross-sensory associations, that small is high pitch, or that high pitch is high up in space, even though they don't have language to sort of explain high pitch and high in space. There's nothing that can be explained by language with them. They may well have learned this from the environment in some ways, because obviously large animals make deeper noises. But what's important in our study is it's abstracted away from animals so that it is now an intuitive rule known by the dog, in the same way that humans also know this intuitive rule, and in a similar way that synesthetes express these intuitive rules with conscious experiences. Okay, so I'm going to switch topic now and spend the rest of my talk describing synesthesia proper, synesthesia in children. So this body of my research was really sparked about sort of 5 or 10 years ago, because I would repeatedly get emails from the general public, from parents describing their child and saying, does my child have synesthesia? Now, at the time, we knew very little about synesthesia. We really didn't know how to detect synesthesia in a child. We didn't know what synesthetic children were like or anything about how synesthesia was developing. So I applied for a grant from the European Research Council, and we received a very large amount of funding to spend the next half a decade or so looking at synesthesia in children. And our questions we were asking were, how does synesthesia, proper synesthesia, how does it develop in children? What are the comorbidities? If a child has synesthesia, what else might they have? Are there any advantages to having synesthesia as a child, or any disadvantages? And how can we diagnose and support it? And we looked particularly at 2 kinds of synesthesia. We looked at coloured letters and numbers, and we looked at the personification synesthesia. And remember, both of them, we picked these 2 because they're reasonably common and because we understand the brain basis of both of these conditions. Subtle, benign differences in the brain giving rise to these experiences or associated with these experiences. So one of the first things we did is we generated a test for synesthesia in children, and we based it on a previous finding that synesthetes are very consistent when they describe their synesthesia. And so in this diagnostic for children, we presented a letter or number at the top of the screen, and we asked children to tell us what color what would be the best color for that letter or number. And we said there's no right or wrong answer. You know, most children do this quite randomly, but they could choose any color they wanted from this drop-down bar here, and then they could pick any shade at all that they wanted from the shade box. And we showed them all of the letters and numbers in a random order, all of the alphabet and the numbers 0 to 9. And once they'd given us a colour for every single one, each child, we then surprised them and asked them to do it again. So they saw the letter N twice, they saw the letter A twice, they saw the number 3 twice, just in a random order. And each time we said, give us the colour. And what you find from an average child is they're very, very random. If you ask them for the colour of K, the first time round they might say blue, and the second time round they might say grey. They're just not consistent over time because they don't have synesthesia. They're not consistent. They don't have associations. But when you look at synesthetic children, you find they are consistent. If they told you that the letter A was green first time round, then they would tell you it was green again the second time you asked. If they told you J was red, they would tell you that twice, and so on. Slightly different shades, but pretty much the same colour. And it's this consistency, we can quantify this consistency. And it's when we see this consistency that we know we have a child with synesthesia. Now, don't forget, synesthesia is growing in childhood. So when I look at how consistent this child is, I can tell they must be about 10 years old. Because when they're a little bit younger, it's a little bit less consistent. They're still consistent enough for us to pick them apart from average children. Okay, so that's what we did. We created a diagnostic, we worked out how consistent you had to be at each age to be a synesthete, and then we applied this diagnostic. We screened 5,500 children. Every single child individually screened for synesthesia, and among them we found around 120 synesthetic children. We not only had the test for coloured letters and numbers, we also had a similar test that could find the personifier synesthete. So here they were consistent with the personalities they were describing for letters and numbers. Okay, so once we had found all of these synesthetes, the first thing we could do was find out how common synesthesia is. And it turns out that the average size primary school in the UK has 6.2 of these synesthetes at any given time, let alone all the other kind of synesthesias. But there are 6 synesthetes with coloured letters and numbers or personalities in the average size primary school. That's very interesting because one would suspect that the head teacher has absolutely no idea that there are as many as 6 children in his school with synesthesia, but that's the first thing we found. The second thing we asked is, what are these child synesthetes like? If you have synesthesia and you're a child, what else might be different about you compared to other children? So how might you be different in your personality? How might you be different in your well-being, in your academic skills, and so on? So as well as testing every single one of these 5,500 children for synesthesia, we also gave them 24 different other tests. Every child had, tests for synesthesia and 24 other tests, and their parents had 5 different questionnaires. And that these are all the tests we gave. And that allowed us to find out how good their vocabulary was, what their personality was like, what their math skills were like, how their empathy was, what their anxiety levels were, and so on and so forth. And so I'll just pull out a couple of findings from this body of work. This has been well published now in a number of different articles, but I haven't updated the slide. Okay, so first of all, let's find out first thing we wanted to find out is, what is the personality traits of a child synesthete? Do they have any specific personality differences? So what we did is we gave all of the children who were old enough a personality questionnaire. And this is a well-known personality questionnaire. It's called the Big 5 Inventory. And it looks a little bit like this. So we give the child different kinds of traits, like being talkative, being relaxed, doing things carefully. And the child just has to say whether they agree or disagree, whether it's like them or not. So if they're very talkative, they would agree strongly. And if they're not very careful, they would disagree strongly, and so on. And for the younger children, we gave them a similar questionnaire, but with pictures. So are you like this child who does things carefully and completely? Or are you like this child who doesn't do things carefully and completely? Okay. And we also gave a personality questionnaire to their parents. Now, these personality questionnaires, it's called the Big 5 Inventory because it allows you to understand somebody's personality broken down into 5 parts. It allows you to understand how extroverted or introverted they are. That's the first part. It allows you to understand how agreeable the child is. Do they get on well with other people? It allows you to understand how conscientious they are. Do they work hard? Do they do things carefully and completely? It lets you understand how neurotic they are. Now, neuroticism is just a word that psychologists use really to mean how much they worry about things. And finally, this final trait here is a trait called open to experiences. And that is another psychologist word that means really whether it's the part of the personality that's about being creative and sort of intellectually curious. Okay, creative and intellectually curious. And this is an important one because this is where we found the effects to lie. We found that synesthetes were significantly higher in openness to experiences, significantly more creative, significantly more intellectually curious, and that was true for both kinds of synesthetes. Now, colleagues had already shown this in adults, but so in adults, my colleagues had already shown that adult synesthetes are higher in openness to experiences, but this is the first time we've been able to show it in children as young as 6-year-olds with synesthesia. And we also found that not just the children thought so, their parents agreed as well. Another finding was that children with synesthesia were different on this trait here. They were not more extroverted, they were more introverted. So children with synesthesia were more introverted compared to their peers. And that was for this kind of synesthesia here. So we know that they are different in their personality. We also found that they had differences in their well-being. And unfortunately, children with synesthesia were showing poorer well-being than everybody else, even though they didn't really know that that nobody else, they didn't really know they were special. Their parents didn't know they were special. The experimenters didn't know they were special. Nobody knew who the synesthetes were until we finished the whole study. But once we found out who the synesthetes were and compared them to everybody else, we found out they were showing greater anxiety disorder. Now, this is something we already knew in adults. This is a study I ran with Duncan Carmichael and our team in Edinburgh at the time. And we found that adults with synesthesia, we screened 3,893 adults, and we found that the synesthetes were twice as likely to have anxiety disorder compared to everybody else. We ran the study again with another almost 400 people, and again, we found that synesthetes were twice as likely to have anxiety disorder. And what we did here with children was we showed that this is true even in the very youngest synesthetes. So we found that children between the ages of 6 to 10 who had synesthesia were twice as likely to have anxiety disorder compared to children without synesthesia. Now, it's really important when you look at anxiety in synesthetes, you can sometimes miss the anxiety effect. Okay? So quite often what psychologists do is they put out an advert for a study on synesthesia, and they say, synesthetes, come forward and we'll test you. Now, if you advertise in that way for your participants, then you're not likely to find the anxiety effect, because all of the synesthetes who make an effort to come forward to, and everybody who comes forward to be tested, they're not the anxious ones. The anxious ones will hold back. The anxious ones do not want to reach out to scientists at university. They don't want to do tests, they're anxious, they're holding back. But in a study like these on the screen now, some of our studies, we've individually tested thousands of people. We haven't relied on anybody coming forward and making an effort. We've gone to, say, the entire population of 20 primary schools, tested every single child. And when you recruit like that, when you don't rely on making an effort to come forward, that's when you see the anxiety effects emerging. And this is just, in this study with children, we actually tested, we used questionnaire methods to detect anxiety. Okay, so we also looked at their academic skills. And there's a lot of good news here, because children with synesthesia are academically gifted. They're better than their peers. So then in the first study, we found that synesthetes have better vocabulary skills. So we found that synesthetes had a bigger vocabulary when they come to understanding words, and they also had a bigger vocabulary when it came to producing words and saying words. So here's the test of understanding vocabulary. We would give them a card that had 4 pictures on it, and we would ask them to point to point to the rodent. And if they point here, then we know that they understand what the word rodent is. And what we found is that synesthetes were much better in this task compared to controls. And then we gave them another test of producing vocabulary. And here we didn't say the word, but we tested whether the child still knew it anyway. So here we would give a picture and a definition. So a fertile place in a desert. What's this called? And children with a good vocabulary would say, oh, it's an oasis. And what we found was that synesthetes were much more likely to be in this group of children with a good vocabulary. We also found that children have a better memory span. So here we would have a card, and the child couldn't see it, but we would read out a string of digits, so 603 7451, and the child would have to repeat it back to us. Okay? Or we would say, repeat after me, 371592, and the child would have to repeat it back. And what we found was that the children with synesthesia have better, longer memory spans, because this list gets longer and longer and longer until the child can't do it anymore. And what we found is that the synesthetes were holding in there. They were still able to recall even some of the very longest digit strings. Okay, so that better memory span for digits. And that was true for those with coloured letters and numbers. We also found they had better spatial skills. So we would give them a spatial picture and ask them to reconstruct it with blocks, and synesthetes scored significantly better than their peers. We also found they had better numerosity. Now, numerosity is not mathematics. It's a kind of sense of number. So here's the test we give for numerosity. What we do is we show the children on screen very briefly a series of black and white dots. And the question is, are there more black dots or white dots? So I'll show you a test here. So it comes on screen, it disappears from the screen, and the task is, were there more black or white dots? So here there were more black dots. Okay? So, and what we found was that children with synesthesia were significantly better. They could detect the differences between, many and fewer dots much better than other children. So at this point, we paused for a minute because we wanted to understand why. Why did children with synesthesia have better memories? And what we found was that somehow the coloured numbers help them with numerosity. It's the colour of the numbers that will help them, or the synesthetic association with the numbers that will help them. And the reason we found this was because we were able to test this because we were able to look for children who did not have synesthesia, but still had coloured numbers in their memories. So what we did was we screened 3,236 children between the ages of 6 and 10. And all of these children were taught with something called Numicon. So Numicon is an educational number tool. And it's a series of plastic shapes. And classrooms in the UK have these plastic shapes for children to use to learn addition and subtraction and so on. And they have colour fixed for each number. So orange is always 1, blue is 2, yellow is 3, and so on. And what we did is we screened 3,236 children who use Numicon in the classroom. And what we did was we asked them, so we took the Numicon away. There's no mention of Numicon in our test. And we just said to them, tell us the colours of numbers. And what we did was we identified all of the children who, when you ask that question, say 1 is orange, blue is 2, 3 is yellow, and 4 is turquoise, and so on. And we found a small group of children who had clearly learned the colours of Numicon. Even when Numicon was nowhere near them, they still knew the colours of Numicon really, really well, just by us saying, tell us colours for numbers. And what we've, and this was the test we used again, we put numbers in the corner of the screens and we asked them to tell us the colours of each number. And we identified the children that said that 1 is orange and 2 is blue and so on. And we found the children who did this significantly more than anybody else. And what we found was that internalizing these Numicon colours improved their numerosity. It gave a 5% improvement in their numerosity, and it was significant. So children who had internalized the colours of Numicon were better at numerosity, even if they weren't a synesthete. So there's something special about coloured numbers that helps numerosity. Okay, and this may be why synesthetes are better. Okay, so I'm going to just sum up some of the key ideas from the talk today. The first idea really is that childhood matters in synesthesia. It's where key developments take place for people with synesthesia. The other thing I talked about was that when it comes to where synesthesia comes from, one thing we do know is that having multisensory crosstalk is not unique to synesthetes. Everybody has these low-level intuitive associations that they're not really aware of, but they can be elicited in experiments. And when we do elicit them, we find out that they're quite similar to the associations of synesthetes. Okay? And that suggests that maybe synesthesia is somehow part of the normal typical brain. Of course, it's part of the normal typical brain. Synesthetes are normal, of course. What I mean is synesthesia is part of the typical average brain. It's just, you can see it expressed in just a very small percentage of the population. And actually, you can even see it in non-human animals like dogs. And then we also find that children with synesthesia have these benefits and these challenges. So as a challenge, they are higher in anxiety disorder, but they also have all of these other traits as well. They're introverted and creative, and they have better vocabulary, better numerosity, better digit recall, and they have these spatial skills. So there's this sort of slight difficulty with synesthetic children in that they are higher in anxiety. And then there are these other traits that are just part of what it means to be a synesthete. So introverted, creative, better vocab and other skills. So I'm just going to end by saying if you are a parent of a child with synesthesia, or if you're a teacher, then please do come to our website. If you click on these options here, if you're a parent, you can get a downloadable information form about synesthesia to share with your school. If you're a teacher, you can learn about how to support synesthesia in schools. If you're a researcher, there's lots of bibliographies, and a clinician, there's lots of information about other comorbidities that sometimes go along with synesthesia as well. So we hope that helps. Okay, so thanks very much to my team. There's a really amazing team, but these are some of the key players: James Hughes, Rebecca Smees, Abby Ipser, Duncan Carmichael, Emily Roos, Louisa Rinaldi, James Alvarez, and this is my colleague Jamie Ward that I've been working with for the last couple of decades in lots of different studies, including some of those here. So thank you very much for listening.